Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the FiveDshow. This is your host, Sean, and we have the producer, Alex, still here on his headset. So, joined with us today, we have Garret Hohl. Garret is co-founder of Hockey Data Inc. You can find that at hockeydata.com. He is also the co-founder of hockeygraphs.com. That's a cool spot to I really recommend you check it out. They got 14,000 followers on Twitter, so obviously other people agree with that. And he's also a consultant for teams and players and agencies, so pretty good guy to hear on the show. Garret, how's it going?
Pretty good, given, all the things that are going on right now. I mean, there's a lot in the world right now today,
Yeah,
so at least I'm safe and healthy, so I can't complain about being blessed there.
yeah, that's the big thing right now. It's oh man, it's just one one thing after the other. Lots of crazy and terrible stuff going on right now. But I guess the first thing we'll touch on before we really dip into some stuff here is uh, the format announced today. NHL announced the playoff format. I just wanted to quickly ask your take. Is it what you expected, or are you happy or not? It seems like there's a big mix, and I mean you can't make everybody happy, but what's your feeling with how that is given the circumstances?
Yeah, I mean, I think you kind of hit a good summary with the fact that you can't make everyone happy no matter what. There's going to be some issues, and these are, multi-million dollar, billion-dollar companies, and the NHL wants to get as much return on investment as possible, especially because not all of their franchises are money makers. So many of them are money burners, and they want to minimize how much they are burning.
Yeah,
So with the most important thing for a sport that's gate revenue driven is to have games, and so I can understand why cutting the season short and just, skipping over when it's not for something that's like, for example, when they have a lockout, the argument there is like, whether right or wrong, they're cutting short-term revenue for long-term revenue. That's the
yeah,
idea behind it. But with this is, the only real positive to, cutting everything short is, protecting their players and protecting the public, which, obviously is important, but financially doesn't fit in the equation. So, in terms of the actual layout itself, I mean, it kind of depends on who you're a fan of. If
yeah,
you're with how sports go, if you're a pretty outside shot of making the playoffs, all of a sudden you might have a better chance of winning because in smaller samples there's more luck involved, and
yeah.
uh,
Good
that
point.
that's going to help out some teams.
Yeah, that's actually something else I would love to talk about. That so obviously a little backstory on this. I've actually I've been following you, Garret, on Twitter for quite a few years now. So I definitely knew that you'd be someone I would enjoy talking to on the show here. And back, whatever, we'll touch on some of this more later, but I guess just the luck part of hockey, the it's not you're not always gonna have the best team win. It actually not that often. So it is super interesting this year going into the playoffs where like you could really have any of these teams win. It's wide open. I mean, who knows what this break is going to have on some of these teams, and the fact that they're going right into a play-on series. I mean, it's not a whole lot of time to get going. So I look at some of these teams that did pretty good this season that have to go play this best of five series, and in a sport like hockey where there's that luck factor. You're not necessarily going to have the best team win in a best three out of five, let alone when these teams are coming in playing their first game in 3 months. So I think it's I don't know, like what teams do you like? Like, do you see this benefiting anyone, or is it just a wide open crapshoot at this point in that first series?
I'll touch in on just the topic of luck in hockey and sports, and from a statistical standpoint, and then I'll kind of answer the other question. Um, when it comes to luck, generally speaking, most people when they think of luck in sports, they think of the weird bounces, like someone
Yeah.
shoots a fluky goal, or they score a fluky goal from a bad angle because the goalie kind of made a mistake, or it's a weird bounce off of the butt of some player and it goes in. From a statistical standpoint, luck is looked at a little bit differently. What it
Yeah.
is the less likely outcome happening, and so you have in sports, everything's about probability. You want to have the best team possible because the best team possible gives you the best chance of winning, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you win. And hockey, just because of the way that it is, for good or for bad, is a sport where the weaker team wins far more often against the strong team relative to other sports. Now, that's can be a good thing or can be a bad thing. I quite enjoy it because it means that anything can happen. It's fun to cheer for the underdog and stuff like that. When you look at, like, for example, another sport on the opposite end of things, where you look at, basketball, the stronger opponent wins far more often um, against the underdog. So that when you're looking at something with a play-in series, what you're doing is you're reducing the sample size, and so that's going to benefit the weaker teams because now they have a much greater chance of getting into the playoffs and moving on than they had before. But this is going to harm the stronger teams, and that doesn't
Mm-hmm.
necessarily mean from the standings, because again, based off the same logic, the standings is going to correlate with how good teams are, but it's not going to be a definitive answer for who is the best and who is the worst.
Yeah, yeah, perfect. That I think that's a pretty good summary that even I could follow. So I'm sure that everybody could follow with that. As I touched on earlier, I have been following you for a while, number of years on Twitter, and actually, funny story is when I first started following you, I followed you for your take and take on statistics and everything in the game. At that point, I actually knew next to nothing. I was just a big hockey fan that played hockey all my life through junior until I finished, and I was I'm kind of not the brightest person, like so I was never a big numbers guy, and I didn't really understand it. But it's such a big thing in the game now. Is just like diving deeper into different types of what makes a player good, player value and stuff like that. And I've learned so much just from yourself and the rest of the community online, and I think it's people are starting to, become more aware of the impact of different ways of looking at the game instead of how people looked at it, 20 years ago and stuff like that. And I think it's really cool. So we talked about well, you talked about trying to build the best team possible to win. And that's obviously the biggest thing in hockey, and obviously, clearly. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, you know, like value of a player. We could use, for example, on Winnipeg, Nikolai Ehlers, like the value that he brings. And then you could go to the counter side, someone like a Leon Draisaitl or a Kyle Connor, who brings, they have the ability to score goals. But what I think a lot of people don't realize, who don't follow this side of the game, who just, the casual fan on TV, would be just surprised to know just, how weak Kyle Connor and Leon Draisaitl are in certain areas of the game. And so I just wanted to get your take a little bit on, some of the things that brings value to a player that maybe a normal person who hasn't started following this would not be aware of. And I touched on Ehlers and Draisaitl and Connor, but you could spin any way you want. And kind of just some things that we are now starting. More people, more fans are starting to realize ways to put value on a player besides the stats. You know, the old stats like plus minus and stuff like that.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I'm trying to think of the best way to answer it without taking 40 minutes of your time. I mean, yeah, obviously, like when it comes to statistics, the whole point of it is for two reasons, kind of figuring out, how good a player is, and also, actually, I should say three reasons. How good the whole aspect of stats in hockey is used for three things: to figure out how good a hockey player truly is, why they're good as or as bad as they are, and how to make someone better or use them better based off of that. And most of the time, people focus on the first thing, but the second two things are also kind of important.
Mhm.
Now, in terms of like evaluating a player, I mean, the biggest you have what we call like holistic or single number stats, and like they're not perfect in any sense, but they're estimates to give you an overall value. Like, and a lot of it comes from like the nomenclature from baseball with WAR, where it's like this is how many wins a player is worth relative to a replacement player, which is where the name
Yeah.
comes from. And what it is it looks at the game in multiple different. Talking hockey now, it looks we look at how the game is played in different aspects of the game, um, and how they impact and how well does the team perform relative to expectations given the outside variables. And you kind of and while these numbers can be very sophisticated and weird and like and how the algorithms can shape up and like the coding to build those algorithms can be very weird, it does make sense from a hockey intuitive sense. So generally speaking, when you're looking at these like single number stats, what they're trying to look at is basically three offensive areas and three defensive areas. And they're the things that players are trying to do. And that's one, create more opportunities. When offense has three portions: one, creating more opportunities; two, making those opportunities the best possible opportunities; and three is, trying to finish those opportunities as best as they can. So that's shot quantity, shot quality, and finishing talent. Um,
Mhm.
and then from a defensive end, it's just basically the opposite. It's, trying to reduce those chances, trying to reduce the quality of those chances. And unfortunately, players can't really influence um, the third aspect of, the opposite of the offense, but that's goaltending. So you can impact, obviously, can't impact how strong of a shot or how accurate of a shot the player has. You can more impact where the quality of the shot in terms of where it is. So those are like the offense and the defensive, and all these things. What they do is they look at so then you got that overview, and from these stats models, what they do is they look at how a team performs in these different areas with a player on the ice relative to how you'd expect given all the other players that are on. That's his line mates and his opposition and other outside factors like who's the coach, whether or not you're rested the day before. And you can start adding all these environmental impacts. And all that is just, trying to suss out some of the noise. So that's the overview of like how these WAR statistics and how they work out and trying to getting an overall value of a player. And then from that, you can kind of start to see what are certain strengths and weaknesses. But you can also have like a kind of psychological and philosophical look at to how people have viewed players and get their values from players and how that differs from statistics and why that might be. And that's always been part that's kind of intrigued me. And going back to your kind of player examples, so when we look at the numbers, we see that like Draisaitl and Kyle Connor had exceptional offensive value. Like the numbers match what you see, and like obviously you say no kidding, because like Obviously, they scored a whole bunch of goals. Obviously, they're going to have great offensive numbers. But I mean,
Yeah.
there's more to offense just than scoring goals as well. I mean, if I'm just going to make up an example, but let's say I'm a player that's really good at breaking out the puck, and sometimes I'll get the odd assists out of it, but because I'm really good at breaking out the puck, my line mates are always getting more scoring chances in the long run. So my team's scoring more goals. I'm impacting offense in a way that might not necessarily be shown on my offensive my offensive point totals. So
Yes.
when you see players that score a lot, generally speaking, they are adding a lot of offense, but there's more ways to add offense than just the direct, obvious impacts. But for the most part, we do find that those things kind of correlate because generally speaking, if you're skilled with the puck enough to, create offense for your line mates, you're skilled enough with the puck to create offense that you'll also get points off of. And for the most part, people see these kind of events. And so that's why you'll see that generally speaking, offensive value kind of correlates to what fans see, and also historically how GMs kind of made decisions. Um,
Yeah.
Everyone kind of knows who are the best offensive players, no problem, because of the fact that you see them create these events and they stick in your mind, and that's kind of how your mind works, right? We don't How our mind works is that we don't see 1,000 different events and store all 1,000 events into our brain. Our brain picks the events that are the most meaningful or the most wowing, and those kind of stick with you. And so when you see like McDavid make all these crazy moves and score all these goals and you cheer, you're going to see these moments and they stick with you. And so that kind of correlates with offense very well. But one of the things that we notice that fans don't really see is things like defense. And um, while really, really good eye tests can detect defense quite well, there's a disconnect here. And the reason why there's a disconnect is because, generally speaking, when people evaluate defense, they're looking at how well a player sticks to a certain structure in the defensive zone and how they make certain plays in the defensive zone. But defense isn't doing good when you're in the defensive zone. Defense is the prevention of chances, right? And so you can see a guy,
Yeah.
like you're playing against McDavid, and you can see whether or not a guy does a good job at keeping McDavid to the outside or whatnot. But you can't see McDavid never getting a chance because he never had the puck to begin with. And so that it disconnects from your mind. You can't see things that never happened in the first place. And so that's why there's sometimes a disconnect with these players who create a lot of offense, but sometimes have bad defensive impacts, because you look at a player like Kyle Connor or Leon Draisaitl, and while they were some of the top players, top three in creating offensive chances, they were also one of the worst players in terms of creating chances for the opponents. And so there's a trade-off there, because goals against still matter, because it's not the team that scores the most goals that wins, it's the team that has the best goal differential. And so that kind of can disconnect, but also stats has allowed us, because we can kind of measure how things work, is we can look at things like, for example, drawing penalties and put an actual value to that. And so that's something that, for example, Nikolai Ehlers has been one of the top players in the NHL for a very, very long time in terms of drawing penalties. And so he creates a lot of value in that. And that's not necessarily something that people will instinctively look at a player and be like, well, he draws a lot of penalties, and that's worth almost as many wins as half of Draisaitl's offense. I'm making that number off the top of my head. That's not a real number, but
Yeah.
that's something that a general fan might not be able to detect right away. And like even a hardcore fan, or even like someone who has an exceptional eye for the game, they might know that, hey, Nikolai Ehlers is very fast, he's good with the puck, and like I see him draw penalties every once in a while. But to be able to look at that and say that is worth this many wins, that's something that's a lot more difficult to compare two different things. Like, how does Draisaitl's offense compare to his defense, compared to his penalty killing versus his penalty drawing, that's not something that's very intuitive in being able to weigh how much those things matter relative to others. And that's kind of where stats come in.
Yeah, that was no, that was great. That's like you said, there's a good way to sum it up in a short amount of time. No, that's and you touched on things like, for an example, Nikolai Ehlers and his ability to draw penalties, and not that long ago, people weren't really, I don't want to say weren't because I don't really know, but it wasn't out there as much. So teams might not have been tracking those little things 20 years ago. And now teams are trying to get ahead of each other with these different methods of tracking. Obviously, everyone, I think most fans now are starting to hear the older models, you got, but they're still out there, the Corsi and the Fenwick and stuff like that. And that stuff has been around for a while now, but I think people are just starting. Like I said, we keep touching on the average or casual fan, or the hardcore fan with the eye for hockey, maybe not realizing these little things. And I've been the last 3 years, I've been really keeping track. Well, I watch the games of players bringing value. Some of the stuff you touched on, penalty drawing. I'm talking about guys that move the puck into the neutral zone, through the neutral zone well, and you touched on that as well, that maybe it won't always show up on the score sheet. They're bound to get their assists and stuff like that, but there's players that are really good at that. There's also players that, are really good at zone entries. And that's such a big thing in today's game, is getting that zone entry, especially on something like a power play. And again, keep coming back to players like Ehlers, but guys that can get that zone easy, make it look easy. And then obviously you have players that can just drive play. And that's what I think a lot of people maybe don't realize. So it's kind of good to touch on somebody like Kyle Connor or Draisaitl, these players that put up points, but maybe they aren't driving the play, and maybe it would benefit them to have a driver with them on their line. So that's kind of where I'm at. And obviously with stats, and I've heard you say it before too, it's like all these stats, it's just a means to an end. Like it's part of the picture. It's part of the whole picture, as
Uh,
I've seen before.
Sorry, the pun with my last name.
Yeah, that was a pun. I actually seen that on one of your sites there. I thought
Yeah,
that was good.
I lost that battle.
But yeah, that's great. But I guess moving on to something a little different, you talked a little bit about baseball, and I think most people by now know a little bit about that baseball is heavy into player evaluations, buying wins, and back to even back to even the Moneyball, like the movie Moneyball. In hockey, like Money Puck, I think more and more teams are starting to do exactly what you said, right? And that's find these players that maybe aren't the Draisaitl's or putting up these big numbers, but they bring other stuff to the table. They bring those things that you don't see with the eye test, and that's the thing that's cool to me, is that Money Puck, is that it is growing in the game. And I think although I still think there is a lot of teams and a lot of people in hockey and general managers, even themselves, that are maybe slowly still a little bit behind in the old goals, assist, plus minus. So, I mean, you would know better than I would, or that the average listener would, about that there is still a lot of people that go off just those old stats, and maybe aren't up to date on this Money Puck, on this buying wins, finding these players. I know one that you used to vouch for a lot was Nick Patan, and maybe he didn't get the greatest opportunity. There's so many players like him out there. I keep touching on Winnipeg just because I know that you follow Winnipeg a little bit as well. And like Dylan DeMello, he's a cheap player that brings value. So I guess just kind of what is your take on moving into this? I keep going back to money puck, but do you think the game in say 5, 10 years from now is going to, once we get some newer people moving into positions with teams, do you think we're going to see a lot more teams um, really putting time and effort into these player evaluations and maybe giving players a chance that wouldn't have got a chance 10 years ago?
Yes and no. Uh, I, 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 I like to make a comparison to baseball because baseball is really interesting. Because one, it's a sport that does better lend itself to statistical analysis, and that's a lot of people poorly make that an argument, being that isn't very meaningful in hockey because hockey's so complex and whatever. And I'm like, there's a lot of stats work that's being done in areas in science that's outside of sports that's way more complex than hockey, where the end result is very obvious, where you're just trying to score a little biscuit inside of a net. It's not that complex, but relatively
Yeah.
speaking, towards baseball, yes, baseball is a lot, because of its a lot of stop start. It's very easy to analyze things because you can isolate things. With hockey being a lot more flow, it's you have to isolate things using more complex mathematical models, where you have to try to account for things like who's the person's line mates, who is the person's opposition, did they start in the offensive zone or defensive zone, who how well are they rested, blah 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 blah. I'm going a little bit off topic, I apologize. But one of the
No,
things
it's
though that's interesting about hockey versus baseball is baseball had a much larger change to the game than hockey, because generally speaking, with hockey, hockey's never had an issue of knowing who's like the best players. So baseball had a problem where there was a lot of players who were just as good as some of the best players, but because of the way they played or the way they looked, um, they weren't considered in the top. They were considered quite near the bottom. Hockey, generally speaking, it was more about the margins. And I mean, like, we've already seen huge influences in the game. The game is a lot more about puck possession and control of the puck. It's a lot more about controlling possession than it used to be, and a large part of it is because of analytics showing stuff about the value of such. But also, analytics has already had some of the biggest impacts I think you'll see in hockey, and the fact that the role of an enforcer no longer exists. And a lot of people are like, oh, that's because the game got a lot faster or whatever. But a huge part of it was the fact that a lot of the arguments for fighting in hockey, not talking at an entertainment level, but talking just strictly from a strategical level, has been shown to not be what we once thought. Generally speaking, like about the change in momentum, about how it influences shots and goal rates, about whether or not it is injury or cheap shot preventative. A lot of that stuff has been analyzed, and NHL GMs and NHL teams saw this analysis, and they realized that it's not necessarily that. Again, this has nothing to do about the value of toughness, but having these guys who are just 3-minute players, because all they're supposed to do is jump over the bench and fight the other 3-minute player, didn't actually have this value. Um, Now, I do think that as we get better and better at analyzing how good players are, because of the fact that that helps us in the margins, you will see people with certain jobs that will get depth roles that they wouldn't have gotten 10 years ago. You already do see that to a degree. But of course, you're never going to get a perfect market. And because of that is that there's aspects beyond having the absolute best player possible on your team. And that's something that even us stats people kind of undervalue at times. So, there's something about rocking the boat, and you look at, let's say you have a team and you have this player who's worth 3.1 wins. How much better are you making that team to make some risk in bringing a 3.2 win player because he's better, right? So, because there's negative
Yeah.
impacts in terms of, what might that influence how might that influence the room, or then you also kind of talk about, um, like intangibles, and people think that stats people are against intangibles. It's not that we're against intangibles. It's just we want to point out that intangibles are called intangible for a reason. You're not certain on how much value you're getting from that. It's not that it doesn't exist. It's the fact that you and I know that maybe a player is good in the room in terms of he creates like actual cohesiveness. He creates people are
Yeah.
trying harder in practice, and there's indirect value to those players. So when you have this player that's when you're looking at a player that's worth 6 wins versus 3 wins, this intangible thing is not that very important because of the fact that you don't know whether or not that is enough to tip the scale. But when you have these players, 3.2 wins versus 3.1, they're, also take into account that, stats are estimates. So, there's a bit of a plus or minus in that guess frame that the true value is. These are just estimates of what the value is. So those players are basically statistically indistinguishable. So this is a very, very roundabout way and me mumbling and ranting on, but saying that, like, generally speaking, you're not always going to see the player that is statistically better get the job being the wrong decision, or getting the job being the right or wrong decision, because there's more things that go into it than just being the best player. So yeah, we'll get marginally better as we learn more and more about the game, and we're able to get the best player possible, and we'll learn how to utilize these players better. But it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be anything that's
Yeah.
going to flip the world upside down, because of the fact that as you move further and further down the roster, you're making smaller and smaller changes between these players.
Yeah, that's you put it into good words there, pretty much talking about comparing these players and stuff like that. And I guess we could really keep going all day here, but we'll I got one last hockey related question for you. Just for anybody that might be thinking this route, but what what advice would you have for anyone that wants to get into hockey, be it in a I don't know, in a management or a scouting, or maybe just into another role? Just what type of advice would you have for those people that maybe in their future want to get into something within
Sure,
hockey?
yeah. I always enjoy these questions because, unfortunately, I can't really speak too much from experience, because my experience is very exceptional in terms of it being the exception and not the rule of what actually tends to happen. I mean, my story is that I was a junior B washout. I was a third string goaltender, not very good. I played the jungle and didn't do so well, and ended up arguing on the internet enough to make a name for myself, and people recognized my arguments as having some sort of value, and people kind of jumped onto that, and it kind of grew from there. So my route is not necessarily the one that I would encourage, because of the fact that um, me getting to where I am is quite a bit fortunate, in terms that I've actually been able to do what I do, just because of the fact that I, as I said, basically argued a lot on the internet and made a name for myself. Uh, and but in terms of like how I actually advise people, I mean, I get a lot of people who go into my DMs or have sent me LinkedIn or sent me emails asking me this very question, and I recently kind of spoke about it on Twitter, open in the public. And I mean, unfortunately, because of the fact that the NHL's management market is very much inefficient. Unfortunately, the number one factor of whether or not you can get an NHL job is whether or not you previously played pro hockey or are a relative of someone who played pro hockey. That is the unfortunate thing, and actually, that's kind of the answer to the question you had earlier. Is what is probably going to be the biggest change is when you look at hockey or not when you look at hockey versus sports that kind of delved into analytics a lot earlier than hockey and how they evolved is the biggest thing is that started changing is management roles. You moved away from people who are former players getting jobs because they understand the game into people that can control and manage companies because they have this experience. Whether or not they're people who've managed, statistical companies or law firms or whatever, uh, start tech startups and all that kind of such. That's probably going to be the biggest change that we see. Not necessarily, who's the fourth line player on Team A versus who would have been the fourth line player 10 years ago. Um, so that is unfortunately the biggest aspect in terms of whether or not you can get a job in the NHL. But that's not true of everyone. It's just the number one factor. Um, and if you are really wanting to
Yeah.
get into a role, the one thing that you'll notice, whether it's my role or people who are in other roles that are very different than mine, is a lot more and more will be leaned upon actual education and experience. So usually what I advise is, depending on what you want to be, whether that's a scout or whether that's, a GM or whether it's just a hockey analyst doing stats work or a database person, these are all very different jobs. And so, but getting education experience in those fields is definitely going to be something that can help you a lot. In terms of education, you don't have to necessarily have a PhD in mathematics, but I mean, you look at baseball, for example, there's people who are interns and they have PhDs. So it is kind of interesting looking at that versus hockey, where, a lot of people have, very little education. They're mostly self-taught. Um, not in a general sense, but there's a lot more examples of those. There are also people with PhDs and such that are working for NHL teams, but it's definitely not the same ratio that you see in baseball and basketball. Um, so like getting some education, whether or not that's in sports management, whether or not that's in analytics, whether or not that's through a university or whether or not that's through some online thing like Coursera, DataCamp, or Udacity, like one of those online places where you can learn. Um, Getting that kind of education, I think, is helpful because the fact that it's more tools to your toolbox, even if you're not someone who's necessarily going towards the role that's the same, learning can never be taken away from you. And that's also why it's good to get experience. I also mentioned, you look at teams that are, whether it's junior A all the way to midget triple A. These are teams that, they don't really have much of a budget. They don't really make much money. And so there's often opportunity there for you to get experience as a volunteer, being, you know, having a having some way that you can help out and learn from how hockey management is or how scouting works or how they do these things. Like, you're not coming in to reinvent the wheel. You want to kind of learn how things are done, and then from there you can look to adjust things. That's always useful. And then the third thing I always say is, start creating a portfolio for yourself. And that is something that I did. Is like that's You mentioned about how I founded HockeyGraphs, and how HockeyGraphs was founded was just like I wanted one place where I could deposit all my thoughts and rants in hockey. When I wanted to test out, people said, "Oh,
Yeah.
um, uh, you know, for example, um, I'm trying to think of an example. Power plays don't matter as much in the playoffs because, they let a lot more go. And like one of the things I wanted to do was, test out, yeah, sure, they more go, but does that mean there's fewer power play opportunities? And so I put that to the test, and, lo and behold, I found out that while the playoffs allow more things go, I guess because of the fact that players then try to because they're getting away with more, they try to get away with more, and it ends up balancing out. And all of a sudden, you realize that the power play opportunities in the regular season is about the same as the power play opportunities in the playoffs. And so, I had this place where I could, create a
Yeah.
portfolio for myself so that I can show, when I wanted to volunteer for a team or when I was, I got my start working for a player agency. You could look into some of the work that I did and have that being used in that area.
Yeah, there's great answer. And I don't even want to get into this, but talking about it reminded me talking about the power plays in the playoffs. That is one thing I hate about hockey. I love hockey, but I hate how the rules change in the playoffs and they let more go. There's not really, I'm trying to think of other sports that kind of have a different set of rules in the playoffs, but I'm interested to see this season anyways, when hopefully when they resume playoffs without any fans, if that maybe has some sort of effect on refs calls as well, without that maybe slight bit of home team advantage. I know some refs it's actually tracked. Some refs have it, some refs don't, but that's that's a
Yeah.
whole different thing I don't even want to open up, but no, definitely. And arguing with people on the internet, that's I think there's a lot of people in the same boat as you there that I even follow some of them. It's funny, but a lot of people maybe started to, maybe not to the extent of you, but there's a lot of people that are already in hockey that whether it's through media or stats or working for teams or whatever, that's still like to troll people on the internet, and it's funny to see. But yeah, it's good. No, definitely. And I have a lot of friends that work in hockey, and maybe they don't have aspirations of going to the NHL, like you said. It's who do you know type of business, just like a lot of stuff. But I have a lot of friends that are working for junior hockey teams, whether it be scouts or volunteering, maybe coaching behind the bench, and it's regardless of whether they want to maybe go somewhere more with hockey. It's a way to get involved, in a way to kind of keep your passion. A lot of people just become fans, and you know like yourself, I'm a washed up junior hockey player that spent a lot of time on the bench. I'd like to say now, I'd argue now that I was good at the stuff that wasn't picked up on the stat sheet then, but I don't think I don't think that was the case either. But no, that's great. That's good insight and good advice for anybody that might want to get into it. And I guess could talk about some of this stuff all day, but uh, you know, thanks a lot for coming on the show, anyways, and for everyone listening, I highly recommend you follow Garret on Twitter, or check out his work and Hockey Data Inc. or hockeygraphs.com. There's a lot of good stuff on there, and I highly recommend, if for hockey fans, if you maybe aren't that into this type of stuff, that you maybe you don't want to be into it. Maybe you just want to drink, crush your beers on the couch and watch the game. But it's really cool to dig into, see, kind of compare these stats against what your eye test showed in the hockey. And that's kind of why I started to get into following it, is I'm watching the game on TV and then I go and actually compare what results are to what my eyes see. But it's cool stuff. And again, thanks a lot for coming on the show, Garret. Liked having you here and explaining a little bit more into this and your role and
Yeah,
stuff like
I
that.
was glad to be on.
Perfect. Take care. That's it. That's all we have for you, everybody, today. Thanks for listening in. This is the 5D show with Sean and Garret on the show today.